Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Podcana episode 42. This week, we are joined by It's Specimen. Specimen, we had you on the podcast a few months ago, I believe, and then I think you took a little bit of a hiatus after that, but it seems like you're back in full force, been reinvigorated by set 3. How's it been going for you?
I am so hooked. It's so good. Like, I think now the game is in a point where with set 3, there's enough cards in the game where it takes quite a long time to optimize deck lists. Deck building is the thing I love doing most. It's kind of what I was known for in Gwent. And I've been looking for a card game really where the deck building experience is as deep and as enjoyable as Gwent's was. And this one, honestly, feels even better. I think it's like the best deck building experience of a card game I've ever played, which is a huge compliment. And I am really, really, really enjoying set 3. I think it's fantastically, incredibly balanced, and there's so much fun stuff to try out.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's the strongest aspect of Lorcana is, for me, I mean, at least when the game first came out, I was a bit hesitant on the design of the game. It looked very simplistic, for many reasons. But the development, like the actual balancing of the cards is so well done. We've seen it through set 1, set 2, and set 3. These metagames just seem to constantly be in flux. I mean, we talked about, a couple weeks ago, we talked about the week 0 metagame, very much dominated by Jafar, the week 1 metagame, and now the week 2 metagame is even different from that. I mean, Moyen took Blue Steel to a second place at a 170-something player tournament, a $1,600 prize pool, took Blue Steel to second place, and it's just incredible. And I feel like, honestly, off the back of that tournament as well, Amber Steel, this is the deck list that won that tournament, is also a fantastic color combination. The mid-range Amber Steel list is awesome. And I mean, Moyen and I have been totally enjoying that list. Moyen, I want to toss it back over to you real quick, just to give us a background on the tournament you played this past weekend, what list you played, and just break it down for us.
So I played Sapphire Steel. The day before the tournament, I watched Zephyr and Sky play the entire day, all the different matchups of Blue Steel. And I rewatched that, and I was very impressed with the deck's performance and potential. So then I also spent the rest of my time before the tournament just testing that deck. Also tested a few matchups with Speci. And the deck kind of blew me away. I made a few changes, not all that many. And I think it's probably, right now, I think it's the best deck in the format.
Okay. Biggest search. I mean, you kind of showed it in the tournament, right? You had a pretty incredible run, only losing out in the finals. What's sort of the current archetype that the Blue Steel list fulfills? Like, what is it trying to do?
It's honestly has the same game plan as in set 2. It just does it better. So it slows their opponent down by playing character first 2 turns, then ramps, accelerates, and stabilizes off a 5 or 6 drop on turn 4. Those are very sticky and capable of singing songs. And then you can either, if you had the Quill opening, you might be wanting to reel soon after and just play the rest of the game with the same amount of cards as your opponent, but just with a lot more resources. Or especially in the Mickey Mouse opening, you're very fine just out-resourcing your opponent without having to reel.
Yeah.
I have a question actually on this deck, if you don't mind. Just something that came to mind. At the moment on Pixelborn, it's showing you in the pre-game what decks your opponents are playing. And obviously with this deck, your whole new world getting discarded by an Ursula or Bare Necessities is going to be pretty heartbreaking, and your mulligan's going to be changing a lot. Do you think this deck is going to become significantly better or worse if you don't know what deck you're playing against for your opponent?
In the tournament, I didn't know what I was playing against. Right?
Okay, that's a good point.
For most of the rounds. And I actually, even if I knew it was, I think there's very little matchups where I would even consider keeping real. And even in those matchups, I would need to have a lot of other stuff already. So I think I'm just throwing away real almost all the time, even if I know the matchup. So not knowing it just makes me mulligan it away all the time, and that doesn't hurt the deck too much. I would say an interesting point regarding that is Green and Ursula. I think Emerald just gets so much better if their opponent doesn't know they need to be mulliganing their songs away. Because you really don't want to have a song in your hand first 4 turns if you're playing against Emerald. But if you don't know you're playing Emerald, I think Emerald is probably the color that gains the biggest edge from the opponents not knowing that you are playing Emerald.
What new cards did the Blue Steel list get in set 3 that has really unlocked the deck? Or at least unlocked it as it's progressed to week 2? Because it was just, I feel like it was a deck that people sort of forgot about. And it was in contention for best deck of set 2. And then week 0, week 1 of set 3, people sort of forgot about it. What new cards have been introduced to the deck list that have sort of unlocked it in this metagame?
I think baseline, it's just Smee. Smee is just making the deck better every game you play it in comparison to Prince Eric. You had to play Prince Eric before to slow your opponent down. Now you can be playing Smee instead, and that's a huge difference. It quests for 2, has crazy synergy with Cogsworth. It can 2 for 1 without the issue that you just value trade and then it gets value traded back because that still has 3 attack. So Smee is the huge upgrade, and then the other 2 new cards would be McDuck Manor and Rise of the Titans, which does at least help the deck play around Be Prepared, which it wasn't really able to before. Before it was just, okay, I have to pressure just so much that they have to be prepared, but that it's not really good for them. But now you can actually, once you're ahead, lock them out of the game by adding some McDuck Manors on top of that. And also, you have some counterplay to location. So that helps the deck a little bit, but I think by far the biggest upgrade to the deck is just Mr. Smee.
Mm-hmm. Quick reminder for anybody listening, for any deck lists we talk about or any materials we reference, they'll all be in the description below, so check out there if you want to follow along. I want to pose a question to all 3 of you, and you can choose what order you want to answer in. I just want you to tell me, whether you call it S tier, tier 0, or tier 1, tell me what the top deck ink combinations are right now, because I believe that it's very much in flux. But for you right now, you don't have to be correct for all of set 3, but if I asked you to name the tier 1 decks in this format, what would you say? We can start with you, Spessy.
I still think Emerald Steel is my front runner as a combo. As everything settles down, Moyen and I, like in our testing, like I played Emerald Steel against his Sapphire Steel deck, and it seemed kind of favored for my Emerald Steel deck, believe it or not, even into Cogsworth. He's disagreeing, but in fairness, the version of the deck I was playing was also playing like Helga and stuff, which I think the deck is probably not going to go down that route. But I'm just a pretty big believer in Emerald Steel. I think it's just got a little bit of everything. You've got the hand discard of Ursula. Ursula, Deceiver of All is also the 3-cost legendary, really good. In fairness, with people playing Pinocchio in Amethyst, that has definitely made the Ursula less impressive. But Ursula being able to sing Let the Storm Rage On is just incredible. And I think Steel and Emerald, when you combine them, they just kind of have everything you need. Also, Morph into Tinkerbell, Morph into Robin Hood, into Beast. Deck's very consistent. You can play a whole new world. You can discard a whole new world with Strike a Good Match if you don't need it. It was my early impression as best deck, and I think once everything settles down, I think it's going to prove to be the best again. I think there's lots of really good decks, though. The game's very balanced.
Moyen.
Yeah, I'll try to not make this too long, but I think Sapphire Steel is the best deck right now. I think it's close against Green Steel, but I think it should be slightly favored still, even if they're playing Bucky versions. Against non-Bucky versions, it's really good. I think the deck that won the 100-player tournament in Germany, the first big local tournament that happened, was Green-Purple, and I think that deck massively took a dump. I'm not even sure it's like tier 2 anymore, because everyone learned how to play against it. Then people tagged, for example, the Ruby Amethyst tag started tagging Pinocchios, which hurt that deck a lot. And Sapphire Steel has an insane matchup against it. So I don't think, like, it is a good deck baseline, but I don't think it has a place in this meta anymore. So I think Sapphire Steel's best deck, and then right behind that, but not too far behind, I would say it's Green Steel and Ruby Amethyst. Maybe those are like the 3 tier 1 decks. And then the 2 next best decks after that, I would say, are Purple Steel Jafar and Amber Steel.
Yeah.
Kawa.
I'd probably have to agree with what Moyen said, honestly. I mean, it doesn't get more accurate than that, honestly. I think it makes perfect sense. For me, from the testing I've done and the decks I've faced, I do think that Ruby Amethyst is still super, super strong. Been really impressed with the location addition to the deck. I think it helps out a ton. I mean, we've already talked about on this podcast how insane we all agree Jim Hawkins is. Like, that card is just absolutely nuts. But it's actually really refreshing, in my opinion, to see some new cards being introduced to the Ruby Amethyst deck, even into this week, right? Because we saw the version of it last week, and now we have, I believe, Maui's Fishhook is featured in a few of these decks to help combat some matchups and stuff like that. So, yeah, I think Ruby Amethyst will remain to be a strong contender in set 3, but I don't think it's going to be as dominant as it was in set 2, or obviously how good it was in set 1 as well. But I still think it will be up there. Like it proves to do powerful things consistently, but I think, like Moyen said, people are experimenting with different things, and there's definitely ways to take it down. So yeah, I know. I have a quick question for Speci, since I know you've been playing a lot, Speci. What's your opinion on aggro right now? Because somebody asked me this on Twitter, and I just answered them, and I could be wrong, because like I was known for in set 2 playing a lot of aggro towards the end. I just think this meta it has way too much steel in it. Steel is just way too good this set, and I don't think I would play aggro just for that reason alone. There's definitely some aggro decks that could get there, even against some steel decks. They might have some fuel, but I think there's way more steel in this set than what there was in last set.
Yeah, aggro's pretty interesting. There's so many different ways you can go about playing it. What I love about this set, again, is like, because there's more cards now, like Rockstar Stitch, for example, you can play pretty good Rockstar Stitch decks in a couple, like with Steel, where you get lots of bodyguards, but you can also play it with Emerald, where you get access to Ursula, which can help your Steel matchup a bit. I do agree, though. I think like aggro is definitely suffering still because of Steel dominance all over the place. But there's some pretty spicy decks. I mean, this deck I was playing on stream today, which Moyen was seeing, where you play probably Emerald. You can also play it with Steel, but with Pride Lands, you can get Rockstar Stitch down on turn 3 now with Pluto. And then you can just go super wide with Pride Lands, reducing the cost of everything. You just play like a whole deck of 1-drops. Like, that deck honestly seems kind of legit to me. It's a bit of a meme for sure, because you have to draw like a lot of combo pieces, but I think the aggro is in a pretty okay spot. I think any meta where aggro is dominating is pretty bad. So I think it's in a pretty good spot. Even this like Amethyst Emerald deck, which Moyen was mentioning before, like it's not like a traditional aggro deck, but it's certainly like a very tempo orientated deck, and that had a pretty good performance at the tournament. I do agree it's not top tier, but what I like about aggro is there's loads of different ways you can go about building it, and I think the decks are less linear in a sense compared to aggro decks we saw before, which was all about kind of like Prince Arthur, just slam and try and get to 20 like ridiculously quickly. There's like some potential now to have like decks which start off quite quickly and then just try and cross the line a bit later. So I think Rockstar Stitch being able to come down on turn 3 is pretty interesting, and I think that the best aggro deck is still maybe waiting to be discovered. But yeah, Steel is always a hard time for aggro, but with Ursula, it maybe becomes a bit better. So
I think that's fair. I think I really agree with what you said there in terms of it feels like there's so many different ways to build aggro now.
Yeah.
Compared to what there was in set 1 and set 2. Like, I mean, in set 1, everyone started off with the whole lemon lime, just Lilo, Simba, go, quest with dudes. But there's been a lot of evolution since, and I do think maybe the better aggro deck will be something that has a card like Rockstar Stitch that has a bit of an engine that it can utilize. I mean, I don't think this particular deck I'm going to say now is top tier by any means, but I did see like the example of some kind of Chernabog decks where you just play loads of high questers at the end. If you get your Chernabog, play that card out, and then you can start doing some kind of like cycling. You can try play like multiple Chernabogs and stuff like that. But ultimately, yeah, I think aggro having a type of engine like you mentioned there would really, really help it out, compared to when you're just kind of just dumping cards and trying to race really fast. So yeah, interesting for sure.
I think that aggro's in the worst state it's ever been in, but at the same time, I think that the general archetypical representation of decks in Lorcana, like the lines are becoming quite blurred. Like the pillars of aggro control mid-range are just not super crystallized at this point. I think most decks are trending towards mid-range and tempo decks. Like I haven't really encountered or seen a deck that I would consider to be very viable that actually puts characters on board and just quests, which maybe it wasn't the best strategy in the past, but I mean that was definitely there was definitely aggressive decks that would just play characters that didn't care what their opponent was doing and they just turned them sideways. I don't think those decks are viable in this metagame at all, and I haven't seen any that I could take seriously, because all the best decks in the metagame, all the tier 1 decks are heavy removal based, because you absolutely need to compete for board. Because if you don't compete for board, you're not just losing to aggro, you're losing to all the other lists that play locations, because you get behind, locations get dropped, and like Moyen said, you get locked out of the game. So Yeah, I think because of that,
Hmm.
maybe our traditional sense of aggro or our traditional concept of aggro is also just evolving in Lorcana. Maybe this sort of set 1, set 2 aggro, just play out my hand, turn him sideways, my opponent removes him as we progress, and maybe I get there, maybe I don't. Maybe we're evolving out of that stage in regards to aggro.
The stabilization of decks when they face aggro, if they run locations as well, is huge because, like you said, aggro usually doesn't care about interacting with your opponent's cards. So if they don't even want to interact with characters, then they're certainly not going to be interacting with locations. So once, I mean, again, we mentioned this last week, but it really does feel like once you get ahead and you start playing locations, it's a huge benefit to you, right? Like it's a super, super good.
Mm-hmm. For question for both Speci and Moyen, is there any other lists out of these, like the top 16 from the Thea tournament last weekend that you want to hit on in particular? I have all of them listed here. I have a few of them pulled up. The one that I thought was particularly interesting was probably Zepha's list. Like Zepha did play Jafar combo and did super well with it. Had a great interactive game versus Moyen as well. That was a fantastic one. I recommend watching it back. But are there any other lists that really stood out to you guys?
There's somehow a Sapphire Amethyst deck, which is mind-blowing. And I've just come off the back of a stream where I was playing Sapphire Amethyst with some slightly memey combos, which kind of seem good. So obviously, like a big problem Sapphire has, right, is it's very slow early game. So if you're opening up with Sapphire, you often need like the be prepared clear or the grab your sword clear. But Elsa kind of, with bounce package, can kind of give you some way of staying in the late game. So I think that's one to keep an eye on for sure. It's like one deck making the top 16 is pretty exciting. And it's not a combo I thought would be viable, but that was like one really out of left field.
You possibly know the name of that player because I'm just looking for the list here. It's funny because Speci and I actually, prior to talking about getting on this pod and prior to the tournament occurring, we're like, man, Sapphire looks like it's in a really weak state. And then Moyen just comes on. He's like, Sapphire still is the best deck in the metagame.
Everything changed.
Yeah, it's a really good sign for the game. I mean, it's incredible that we're all the way into set 3. So many players are playing the game. So many good players. We have a very accessible way to play the game. Like it's a digital game at this point. We maybe don't have access to all of the data, but to have a metagame that is this dynamic and sort of in flux is just incredible. And it's honestly, that's been the story of Lorcana since the game released. And I think that probably hits on why you like it so much, Bessie, because the deck building just feels like there's always a chance to do something new in the metagame because the cards are so balanced.
The Sapphire deck is Eject Shot. So they finished pretty high up in on day 1 as well, because this is like in order. So they had, I think, like a 7-1 or maybe 6-2. I think 7-1 performance on day 1. And Sapphire is pretty interesting because it didn't really get that much new stuff with this list, right? Like the Grammatala stuff, I think Moyen, you'll have an opinion on it. Like feels very lackluster, the legendary Grammatala overall. The other big problem is if you go like Grammatar package, a lot of the time previously with the 2-drop Grammatala, you'd play 1 jump ahead as well. And now 1 jump ahead is just getting sniped by Ursula and Bare Necessities. So it seems like Mickey Mouse plus Fishbone Quill is probably the better way to go. But I was just experimenting today with the new Lucky Dime card with Magicka Dispel. And honestly, I started off like last week I played that deck, I was like 0-10. And today I started to believe a tiny bit that it could be good. So I'm pretty excited to see if anything could happen with this. Like with the Amethyst bounce package, you kind of get some early control with like Rafiki being a nice addition in there as well. Like Madam Mim just has big stats, and of course the Fox can rush. You can deal with locations quite easily. And then if you've got some kind of late game, which Belle and Elsa give you, I think there's some potential here. Mm-hmm. It's very, very important that you have an early game though if you're playing Sapphire with Amethyst, because you don't have those board clears. So definitely pairing like Sapphire with the bounce package. You can't really go too wrong. Will it be a top tier deck? No. We're not going to be S tier or anything like that, but I think it is maybe going to find a home in the metagame. It's certainly the deck I've enjoyed the most, actually, this set so far, based off my couple hours playing it just now.
Let me ask both you and Moyen a question then. Do you think a deck needs AoE board removal in this format to be a tier 1 deck?
No, it doesn't. I mean, maybe if you're contesting the board well enough and consistently enough early game, you don't have to get into the position where you need to be wiping the board, right? That's the other good decks that are out there, what they're doing right now. And to me, the Sapphire Amethyst also stood out because I really didn't expect that to make top cut.
Yeah.
It's not as good as Steel or Ruby in swinging back the board once you've lost it, but maybe it can just be a little better at not falling too far behind because it can play Rafiki for one drops, and then the bounce pack is also pretty good at contesting early game.
Yeah.
The way I tried making that color combination work, I think I deleted all my versions already. I think the way I would go about it though would be to leverage those early tempo tools with Cogsworth though. I don't think the list was playing Cogsworth at all, so that was quite surprising to me. That being said, I think Grammatala's like kind of slow and bad in most matchups, but against Sapphire Steel, or as playing Sapphire Steel, I actually don't like to play other Sapphire decks that play Grammatala, because all the Sapphire Steel board wipes that I was playing, because I wasn't playing hard removal, were just damage based, and you don't just deal 8 damage to Grammatala. That doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, speaking of slow, a lot of people were cutting Bell in most Sapphire lists. How do you feel about Bell making it into the Sapphire Amethyst list? And where do you think Bell is in terms of this metagame? Where does that card land?
I think Bell's unplayable.
Yeah.
Gets Cloudkicker, gets Medusa. I don't want that. It's not necessary for the ramp. I don't want to see that card in my Sapphire deck.
Yeah.
I've also never been a fan of Bell. However, if this Lucky Dime version, which I'm maybe just full copiuming on, having just played it, is good. Bell is good in that deck, right? Lucky Dime, like the 7-cost item, you tap it, you pay 2 ink, and you gain lore instantly. Like then you're gaining 5 lore when the Bell hits the board. So I think that's like what you mentioned as well. Is like, can you win in this metagame with a deck which is not got board clear? And the answer, in order to do that, is you need to either be winning quickly with like an aggro deck of some sort and then discarding their board clear with an Ursula, or you need some kind of cheesy combo which is gaining you a whole bunch of lore in a very short period of time, where you can kind of just get into the late game. And that's where maybe like the Lucky Dime Magicka stuff could come in with this combo. But also similarly, like Jafar is doing that in some ways. The Jafar versions we've seen are like very mid-rangey. But I also think that like an all-in Jafar deck where you're not even playing board clear and you just bank on pulling this combo off is probably not a terrible deck by any stretch. So what I love about the game at the moment is they are starting to introduce these ways of winning in non-linear fashions. And that's definitely something I'm interested in experimenting with more moving forwards.
Yeah, for sure. There's one other card in the metagame that I want to ask you all about, because it was sort of the talk of the town off the back of this tournament, and that's Cinderella. The 5/5 resist 2. You play a song, it can attack unready characters. A lot of people are saying most of the lists that made top 16 would be very soft to a Cinderella. And I've seen that even on Pixelborn in the days after this tournament finished. People are now teching additional cards for Cinderella, want answers to that card. What are your thoughts on the Steel 5/5 Cinderella in this metagame? And do you think that playing something like a Sapphire Steel, do you need to start teching in things like Hades or Let It Go in order to have an answer to that?
Yes. Hades is pretty solid, I think. I know Moyen wasn't playing it, but the fact that his Cogsworth got wrecked by Cinderella was pretty heartbreaking to see. So
I think basically Cinderella was on that tournament on Saturday. All the decks were soft to it. That the card was amazing, but the meta shifts so quickly. Already, every deck is like almost every deck is now playing a few answers for Cinderella, making Cinderella worse. But I still think for Ember Steel, it's a very viable game plan. Just go a few lanterns and you play 4 shifts Cinderella, and you say, "This is my big threat. This is how I end games. I play this." Get ahead on the board, quest for 3 times, and that's very, very dangerous because it can come down as early as turn 4. I think that's the best, most unfair thing Ember Steel can do right now. Also, after that tournament, I immediately, people see the final, they're like, "Oh, this psychopath doesn't play Cinderella answers." Don't you wish you had a Cinderella answer now? After I played like how many? I played was it 9? How many Swiss ones did I play? 8?
I think it was 8.
Eight Swiss rounds, and then top 16, top 8, top 4. I played 11 rounds before facing my first Cinderella. And this entire time, I'm happy that I'm not playing cards that I wouldn't normally want in my deck just to answer Cinderella. And then I faced Cinderella once, and I'm pretty sure I was favored to it. Lose the die roll, even though I was second seed because we were just still die rolling. And then I lose very closely to it. And then people are like, oh, she should have played Hades, should have played Let It Go. And to be fair, now that Ember Steel is rising in popularity, I think it is very reasonable to start including a few answers for that, because not only it helps against the big Cinderella, but it also helps in the mirror. I think, especially Hades is a pretty good card in the mirror once Cogsworth makes it so that both boards basically don't die anymore, and then you just need to raise them, and then Hades helps a lot. Getting a threat that also removes a threat. So I think now I would probably play a few answers, but I'm 100% confident and happy that I wasn't playing an answer in the tournament.
Yeah, I think it's a card gamer fallacy that you'll see when people prepare for tournaments where they look at expected metagames. They want to be insulated against everything, even when it represents a very, very small portion of the game, like that Cinderella just showing up in the finals. I want to ask you guys a fundamentals question in regards to Hades versus Let It Go. Let It Go they have the same effect, but Hades is a 7-cost uninkable body that costs for 2, and Let It Go is a 5-cost inkable song. Which one is better, and is one better in all situations? Just talk to me about the dichotomy between the two cards, because I think a lot of people are looking at the Steel Sapphire list right now, and they're thinking about that kind of removal, and they're wondering, should I put Hades in, or should I put Let It Go in?
I actually don't like Let It Go much personally, but obviously the big advantage of Let It Go is it's inkable, and there's probably already a lot of uninkable cards that you're wanting to play. I do just feel though, like personally, I'm a pretty big believer on being heavy on uninkables, and like I feel like the trade down to playing Let It Go instead of Hades is so big, right? Like with Sapphire, there's not a huge difference between a 5-cost card and a 7-cost card because of your ramp tools. And playing like a 5-cost card, which is giving you no board control in any way or like any tempo in a sense, whereas Hades is like just very, very powerful. Let It Go, obviously, both of them are putting cards into the inkwell, and I feel like when you're doing that with Let It Go, it feels kind of bad. But if you're putting like a pretty big, chunky card on the board that can quest, can challenge, I actually never play Let It Go. I'm not a fan of the card personally, but I think the only reason I ever would if I was like super high on uninkables already, so much so that I couldn't fit the Hades in at all.
Yeah, I would agree. Baseline, Hades is just a better card. Let It Go is the advantage of being singable and it comes down earlier, but basically, even if there's sometimes an early target that you would like Let It Go for, it's still not the greatest answer in the world, because if you have to do that, you're giving your opponent the ink early, which you don't want to be doing. So Hades being that expensive doesn't really matter as much, because that type of card you don't want to be playing too early anyways. So again, it's just if I say I just cannot afford an extra inkable, I could play Let It Go. Otherwise, I also prefer Hades.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. A couple other things in the headlines. One is we had a Pixelborn feature last week. I don't know if you saw. There was an advertisement for the YouTube channel, the Podcana YouTube channel on Pixelborn. So yeah, last week's video did really good. If you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe on YouTube or leave us a review on pod platforms. It's the number one thing you can do. Helps us keep the lights on. And then second order of business. We had a comment from Pavel himself. He said, Pixelborn stats are in categories. You need to scroll down a bit in the Discord post to reach our GM-only stats. 53% win rate going first among all players. 64% is above GMs, Grandmasters. So in the Grandmaster bracket, there you have a 64% chance of winning for going first. So 14% at least differential off of going first.
I find that hilarious that that's the exact number that I mentioned last week. That the 53% is what the Lorcana designers said that they were more close to, whereas I think one of the guy who was interviewing was like, oh, it's a lot higher, and devs were like, oh, with our testing it's actually kind of closer to 50. But yeah, it's clear that when it gets to higher skilled players, the difference is it's a lot higher.
And it's worse in set 3. Moyen, talk to me about what has changed from set 1 and set 2 to set 3 that the first player advantage has increased so much.
Go on, Moyen.
Okay, so basically the things that mitigated first player advantage, I would say, are the board wipe tools where you can come back from behind, right? So I would say that's probably mostly Be Prepared. And Be Prepared as a card is still being played a lot, but it got less prominent because Ruby Amethyst is no longer the best deck, but also because of the introduction of 2-cost Ursula that can just rip it out of your hand. So I think that's a big reason. And then other than that, I just think decks got so much better at no longer letting you come back once they're ahead, because now they even have tools to play around board wipes in locations. So I think locations and the Ursula that takes songs away are a big reason why the edge for going first has gotten even bigger.
Which is probably not a bad thing, right? In terms of, it's good that I think it's good that cards like these exist, but it just means that they really need to look at why this is happening and that they need to probably implement the change to combat this, right? I think having cards like Ursula and locations isn't like a thing to be saying, oh, this is bad because it makes the going first. So it feels bad, right? Obviously, it feels much worse in this set when, you do the die roll, you go second, it's okay. Now it feels like it's going to be really, really hard to win because of these cards existing. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think that they just need to look at this and now really realize that it's more of an issue than what it was and combat it rather than, just saying that these cards are the problem. The problem isn't the cards. The problem is still what it has always been, is that the die roll. You know what I mean? Like they need to improve it. So.
I think it's partly the cards. To be honest, I think it all could be fixed through design. They don't need an external system in order to compensate. I think one of the big reasons that the die roll has gotten so much more significant is due to the increase in efficiency in cards, but mostly in that 1 to 4 curve. But removal in Lorcana is bad. Pretty much all removal is bad.
Yeah. Even the steal removal is like, it's the only removal we have, but it's not the most efficient in comparing it to other games at all. Also, anecdotally, in my tournament one, where I went second on the weekend, going first, I won 14 out of 15 games. And going second, I won 7 out of 16. And so in all of my games, no matter who the player is that was going first, the player that was going first ended up winning around 74% of the time. And that's very small sample, and it's maybe the problem's not as bad as these numbers are making it out to be, but the problem still exists. Also, it was kind of fun because last pod I was like, I let myself speak out this challenge for game designers to play me and see whether they can win 47% of the time. And then during the entire tournament, my chat was like, when I was going second, it's like, oh, you still have a 47% chance.
We're going first. It's our 53%. Let's go, boys. They were saying that Podcana fans should be called 53%ers. Yeah. What are your thoughts, Bessie?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, from my first week of playing Lorcana, I was really loving the game, but I was already concerned about the coin flip aspect of it. I mean, just everything about it just screams that it's a big advantage for going first. And right now, there isn't a single deck in the game which wants to go second, right? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of like, as you mentioned, with control cards. Traditionally, in some kind of control archetype, you wouldn't mind going second, right? Because you're playing more reactively. Currently, there's just no deck which would ever want to go second. So I think we need to see some kind of introduction of a deck which wants to go second. Of course, there's always going to be talk about what kind of tools you could introduce to add into the game to increase the player's chances that's going second. I'm certain that Ravensburger are going to want to keep everything very simple in terms of the game rules. So you see, like, people mention maybe like Hearthstone Coin, for example, where it's like an extra resource where you get like 1 extra mana per turn. Gwent also had a similar problem with coin flip for a long time, although in Gwent it was the player going first that was disadvantaged, and they were given a few extra points essentially. So I would doubt that they're going to introduce anything like that, because I think they want to keep the rules as simple as possible. But then if they're not willing to do that, then they certainly need to start looking at some cards and some decks which would be rewarded for going second, right? At the moment, every time when you're playing a tournament game, you lose the first game, you get to pick if you go first or second. You don't even need to ask the question. Everyone knows that you're going to want to go first. So it would be nice to see some decks which are better going second for sure. But I'm not even sure what those would look like. Like, even a control deck, I'm not sure that there would ever be, with the current way the game works, that I would ever want to go second. Even I can't think of any deck that would You know, of course, it's not in the current game, and I'm not sure that there really is such a thing. So I think in the long term, there needs to be some kind of extra resource or something along these lines, but we'll have to wait and see.
Do you think that they've made that the designers knew, and this is kind of a difficult question, but do you think coming into set 3 that they knew that the percentage would increase this much? Like this, I think that's an interesting question. Like because within testing and stuff like that, there's only so much that I think a play test team can do, and then the real data is reflected through, you know, I would say players like GMs, right? You know what I mean, that play so much that can get this real, you know, all of this data combined. So it's interesting to me to think, did they think by this stage in set 3 and maybe even like set 4 that the win percentage for going first is just going to increase over time because they're introducing more cards that combat, you know, like Moyen was saying, coming back with songs, or do you think it's just something that they're going to just see and like look at it as it goes and monitor it and stuff like that?
It's yes and no. They obviously not. I'd say it's close to obvious, but still developing at this point. But it seems like they just undershot the, like the equity of it, right? Like they thought it was closer to 47-53, which is relatively reasonable. So when we talk about die roll in a card game, I think it's like universally looked at, almost universally, as like a bad thing, like this first player advantage. But I think to some extent it's okay because you want to have levers of variance in a game where the worst player can win, and die roll is a part of that. I think when the differential gets egregious, it becomes not great, and it's honestly it's the worst kind of variance because it's a type of variance that exists completely outside of the game, right? And it's also crystal clear who's getting fucked. Like it's crystal clear who's losing on this variance lever, right? You lose the die roll, there's no like, oh, maybe it's good for me, maybe it's good for, it's like, or it's close. It's not close at all. They're a full resource ahead of you. Like, I think that the value question you're asking when you're saying like, is there a deck that'll ever want to go second? It would have to be a deck and a sort of a gameplay setup where the extra card is better than the resource. And I can't see how that's would ever be possible with the current card pool. And then also one of the tangents, I think another big offender is actually a whole new world, like shift a whole new world. One player dumping their entire hand and getting massive card advantage off their shifting in a whole new world. Like that's a massive first player advantage. But
nice +1 card you have there. Might as well discard it.
Yeah. Yeah. What so let me just ask all of you, do you want to see this first player, second player advantage and disadvantage? Would you like to see the gap closed? And how do you think that they could do that? Do they need to implement this additional system or additional layer, something like a coin, something like maybe the second player starts on a bit higher lore? Or do you think it can be achieved through card design?
I think it needs. I don't think there's card design that could really fix it. Honestly, I think it needs something. It needs some kind of extra resource. I mean, Gwent battled with this issue for a very, very long time, and I have to say that the Gwent fix for this, I think, was absolutely brilliant. Which is essentially Gwent, the player going first because they were disadvantaged, started with some phantom points. Now this could be selected depending on your deck in a kind of different department. So you had some cards which boosted a card up by 5 points. You had some cards which just turned into 5 kind of phantom points on the board. So for Disney Lorcana, you could have some kind of card which you could kind of put in your deck, and it's like, oh, if you're going second, this location starts on the board, for example. How that would actually work in a physical aspect, I think that's going to be the problem, right? But some kind of like location card, for example, which starts on the board and does something. You know, you can have different then abilities, and then you can mix around that, and it gives you kind of more deck building options. Whether or not that's actually going to happen, I kind of doubt. I think like a phantom, like a coin system from Hearthstone might be an easier thing to implement within a physical game.
Yeah, I just want to touch and kind of just agree with Spacey that for me personally, I don't think that card design is going to solve it at this moment in time and moving forward in a few sets, because like that's the ultimate thing that I'm trying to think of is like, if it does solve it, is it going to be in the next 3 sets? Because if it's not solved in set 4 and set 5, because they've designed a lot of these cards, like, you know, when we're playing this set that they're designing like 6 sets ahead or whatever, it's like if they're not really or if they can't monitor this and anticipate this, which it's a very difficult thing to do and balance just through card design, I think we're going to have to see some other system, but I'd like to be proved wrong. Like I'd like to see it balance itself out, but I just don't know how we're going to see that.
Arguably, they doubled down on it with locations as well.
But that's also what Speci said, right? That we need something that's not just game design.
Yeah, no, that's what I mean.
Okay,
yeah.
Yep. So for me, I think the problem can easily be mitigated with just the design of its cards, but I think the problem will still persist. For example, I think Zephyr is very particular about keeping his stats for the matchups in previous sets, and I don't have them up right now. But he showed like his Ruby Amethyst stats from previous sets, and when going first, when going second, his win rate in like a few hundred games, I think, or 100-ish games, when going first or second, was basically the same, or it was not significantly higher when going first. I think in the mirror matchup or something. So there's a few matchups where it's a lot less of an issue, and I think to me that says with different cards being introduced into the game for at least some matchups, the problem can be very well mitigated. But I think first player will still always have an advantage, which is fine. Mm-hmm. I just like if it's 55%, I think or 55% or lower for first player, I think that's totally fine with me. And I would love for there to be an outside of card design rule that mitigates it. I think the cleanest way to do it would probably be second player starts with X amount of lore. But as I agree with Kawa that I'm doubting that will ever happen because they will probably want to keep it simple.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had someone ask me yesterday what the worst matchup for Amber Steel Songs was, and my answer, I think, was very factual. The worst matchup is the mirror if you're going second.
Yep.
Like, I don't think you can get a worse matchup for that deck.
Yeah.
Like, they play Cinderella on turn 1, threaten to sing Let the Storm Rage On, and then what do? And then they, like Brendan mentioned earlier, they can sing A Whole New World and just get rid of your, like, one card advantage as well.
Yep. And I was actually playing that match before I hopped on the pod. Like, it just, I understand that, I don't know, I'm not that against, like, non-games, and I understand they're not great, but I'm okay with, like, variance levers where the better player might just flat out lose, nothing they could do, and that's going to be a minority of games. I'm actually, like, more okay with that than I was, like, a couple of years ago. But still, it just feels like garbage. Like, you just lose it, you just lose the die roll, and then they play it, like, they have this curve, and it's, I don't know, basically your game experience is getting everything removed, losing all of your cards in hand, they get a whole new world. They're shifting before you. Like, it's just, it sucks. And I think honestly, a lot of matchups felt like the mirror was really, really important for going first or second, because even a Ruby Amethyst, like, they get the first Jim Hawkins. Like, if someone Jim Hawkins a location on you, it's like, do you have Maui? If you don't, it's probably over. If they had any tempo on board before that, it's probably over. Yeah, I hope that they do something about it, mostly because as a variance knob in the game, I think that it is very unfun. And I think it's very, very unfun.
I think it's just the worst kind of variance. It's like when I draw, let's say there wouldn't be any first play advantage, and I draw just a tiny bit worse by my opponent, and we both play perfectly, technically I would still lose to variance. Mm-hmm. But that would feel much better. Like, it's not that it's losing to variance. Losing to variance is fine, but just please don't let it be the die roll to the in the extremes that it's right now.
Yeah, for sure. All right, I want to close the book on that topic. And before we head into our listener question section, I want to ask you, Speci, what are your thoughts on Rise of the Titans post-tournament this past weekend?
Oh, mate. Yeah, that is the question. So I played Emerald Steel. I felt like I was super far ahead of the meta in my kind of first, like, 3 or 4 days playing on Pixelborn. And then I took like 5 or 6 days off on holiday and kind of came back and was focusing on playing new decks for videos and whatnot. And then I was like, yeah, I'll just stick kind of my Emerald Steel deck that I had before. I had Moyen here on a call who was, you know, like, looking at my deck. Failed to mention my lack of Rise of the Titans in my deck, which I am putting him down as the reason I got knocked out on day 1. Because, oh my goodness, I got farmed by locations. I never wanted to see another location ever again. Every time someone played a location, I basically should have just gone next. Because, I had Helga Sinclair, who's, like, when she quests, dealing 3 damage to a character. I had Tinkerbell, who,
it's
of course, is
damage character, isn't it?
Yeah, damage.
Damage character. Yeah.
And then
I had Chief Bogo, who's dealing damage to characters.
To characters,
had Tinkerbell, grab your sword. Like everything I had was dealing damage to characters, but not locations. And I just got absolutely railed by these 9 strength locations. I would spend like 4 turns challenging into them, and even though I had the complete board control, like I had Ursula to get rid of Be Prepareds and stuff as well. It was very frustrating. So Rise of the Titans. Of course, there's also, and then along came Zeus, which can be combined with it. But yeah, we're definitely seeing a lot of locations. I think in particular, the Queen's Castle, the 4-cost in Amethyst, and Mukduk's Manor are very, very powerful. Big willpower, questing for 2. But we are seeing people tech against it, like Maui's Fishhook, meaning that Maui can come in at 9 strength to remove those in one swoop. I do feel like the locations are going to get worse as people start teching towards them, but I think it was Moyen that I was talking to about it made a really good point where if someone plays, let's say, Mukduk's Manor, even if it gets answered instantly by Rise of the Titans, it's not like it's a trade. And in fact, Brendan, I think you were in a Twitch chat when they were talking about it. Yeah.
The value prop on it is actual. It's hilarious. Thank God it's inkable. But it is so let's say your opponent plays Mukduk Manor. You have the tech card. You put this card in your deck for the situation. You cast your tech card. You know what you're up? 1 ink. 1 ink.
For Sapphire Steel specifically, I was playing a few Rise of the Titans. I would still be the loser of that trade every time. Because those times, they also decide the timing on this. They can make it so awkward for me to be spending 3 of my ink that turn. Like, what if I have 6 or 7 ink and then suddenly I have to spend 3 ink on Rise of the Titans and I can't play my Gaston, Tinkerbell, or Beast, and it's like I still lost this trade even if I'm 1 ink up.
I actually think that's a really good thing, though. From Gwent, we had a huge problem with cards similar to items called artifacts, and there was a card called Bomb Heaver, which is a very cheap tech card which would remove one of these artifacts and put points on the board, and it was just the most binary interaction that was completely like game defining for a long time, so much so that everything got reworked at one point. And I think it's a much better spot that it is. The locations are still getting that value, like that interaction Moyen talked about, I think is a healthy thing. If like this Rise of the Titans was trading up to these locations significantly, it would be a pretty unenjoyable meta, I think.
That's fair, yeah, I agree.
It's interesting. I think I personally would like a higher trade up value on Rise of the Titans because, like, I mean, to be fair, the card does say location or item, so technically it's not that narrow.
And it's inkable.
The inkable is, I mean, if it wasn't inkable, I don't think you could play it. I actually don't.
Honestly, Rise of the Titans is by far not the best tech against items. The best tech is Maui, Rafiki, Maui's Fishhook, stuff that doesn't just kill the item, but also lets you get a body on top of that. The location, but also lets you get something on top of that. Or even Merlin the Crab. I think Ruby Amethyst is probably the best deck at dealing with locations.
I think that's why Ruby Amethyst is like still looking really good. I was pretty down on Ruby Amethyst chances coming into the set, but and it's got also a great location in its own right. I think Queen's Castle is probably my contender for best card of the set right now. Like that card is insane. Moyen's unsure.
Yeah, I think we're Mr. Smee believers over here for best card.
Yeah, okay, that's kind
even
of fair.
Mukduk Manor, better card.
Yeah,
it's just not though, is it?
It's
maybe it is.
Yeah, Manor Boys. I mean, I think that the metagame already like has warped around locations, which makes them feel less impactful. But it speaks to the power of locations. Like they're incredible. I do think that locations. They do give a bit more first turn equity, I think, than some other card design, but they can all sort of be designed out a bit by a little bit more power creep and ways to deal with locations. I mean, Maui's Fishhook is actually a card that I think we kind of missed in our set review. That is just such a good freaking card, even without locations.
Didn't you guys reveal that one? Or am I wrong?
No,
we didn't.
Oh, God, no. God, no. Our reveals they were good limited cards, maybe. All right.
We revealed a card that can heal locations, an item that can heal locations, and revealed the 3-cost action that gives +2 Challenger and exerts a card.
Right. Yeah, because I remember you were like not impressed by the cards you revealed, and I was like, wait a second.
No, I would say not impressed. Anyway, let's go into our listener question section. If you want to get your question read out on next week's pod, you can shoot us a comment on YouTube. First one here is from Prince. They say, question for Moyen. We already answered this, but do you regret not playing Let It Go or 7-Drop Hades in your Sapphire Steel deck, your second place deck? We answered that, but then they say, also, what are your thoughts on 5-drop Robin Hood?
Oh, I've got a hot take. Overrated.
No, I love the card, but I think it could actually be decent even in Sapphire Steel. I'm not sure I would want to be playing it, but so the cards that you're ramping into, Gaston, Tinkerbell, and Cogsworth are all incredible. But Sad Beast was actually kind of disappointing in my testing so far and in the tournament. And not because the card's bad, and it's not just... It's fine that there's removal for the card in that it dies to Zeus and Medusa. You could say, okay, but if I play this and they have to use their removal, it's fine. The problem is both Zeus and Medusa can come with huge tempo on top of that, and losing that tempo after ramping can lose you the game. So most of the time you'd rather be ramping into a different card. And thinking about that, it would be an upside for Robin Hood that it doesn't die to Zeus, it still dies to Medusa, and maybe the payoff isn't as high for the card sticking for a turn while being undamaged. So I'm not sure I would want to be playing it, but I think it's a totally fair shout.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to expand on your love?
My hot take.
Yeah.
So Robin Hood, great card. Do not get me wrong. But also important to remember, it's pretty... I haven't checked the price, but I know it's pretty pricey. Super cuttable in pretty much every list. It's definitely not like a card you have to play. I don't think you could ever cut Beast for this card. I think that is an awful take. I'm surprised that's come out of your mouth, Moyen. I'm not going to lie. I mean, I get it, like the Zeus, but like Beast has so much upside, whereas Robin Hood is great if you can shift onto it, right? Like if you're shifting onto it, happy days.
Yeah.
I just find the consistency outside of Emerald, where you have Morph, of shifting into Robin Hood to be maybe not quite worth it. So when I was looking at building Amber Steel songs, I was like, I think that Robin Hood could definitely stay in the deck, but I also think it's very cuttable. And just the reaction from my chat was like, that is blasphemy. Cutting Robin Hood's ridiculous. And I'm like, okay, I do agree it's controversial and might not be correct, because I do think Robin Hood's good, but I think people are overestimating how good it is. You've also in Steel already got Beast, as Moyen mentioned, which is already a card which is being removed by Medusa. I would never cut Beast personally, and I think having the option then of just inking Beast and then not having Robin Hood in your deck, for example, that's just another card that's getting railed by Medusa, is a pretty good one. So I like Robin Hood in Emerald with the Morph. More consistency, and I think it's great elsewhere too, but you know, like playing a 2/2 1-drop when you could be playing Captain Hook and Smee on turn 2 does feel not great.
So I think it is important to not play too... In the Sapphire Steel deck, it's important not to play too many targets for Medusa, because if you're not playing too many targets, then you're capable of inking all the targets and just letting Medusa hit jank shit. And that's important. But in Ember Steel, I would also say it's blasphemy to cut Robin Hood. It doesn't matter that it doesn't happen all the time. When the shift on 3 happens, it's can absolutely break the game and win you the game as a Singer 5, and just a threat that can take out stuff while gaining draw. Plus, a lot of the times when it's removed, you are actually drawing a card still.
No, I do agree. It's like, it's probably just about worth it, but again, I think it's super, when just the fact that it's like people are like, you cannot cut this card. I think you absolutely can. There's other options. You've got like the Gaston Singer 5, for example, and at 3. And it's more so the fact that, okay, that combo can happen. You can get it down on turn 3, and it's great when it does. But I haven't done the maths on it, but how often does that actually happen, that you find like the 1-drop Robin Hood? Of course, there's also quite a lot of removal in the meta where it's like quite likely, maybe not likely, but quite possible that your 1-cost Robin Hood is just getting removed anyway. So I do think it's overrated. I think it's very replaceable, but I also still think it's a very, very good card. I think it's very well balanced, in other words.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well,
also, I just switched the mic. I was on my headset mic. Apologies to the listeners.
I was wondering what that was. I I thought I was going crazy there for a sec. How did you even do that on demand? That's wild. All right, next one is from Melinton. They say, for those who have a difficult time understanding Kita, when you play Kita, put a -3 strength token / marker on all characters / glimmers in play. Remove them at the beginning of your next turn. Yeah, we talked a little bit. We were kind of confused how Kita worked, and a lot of people chimed in on the solution to that. So I wanted to follow up.
And it is in play. Yeah, that's the biggest thing there. Is it's all characters in play when you play the card, not characters that come in with rush and stuff like that.
Yeah, and it still
Kind
affects
of kills the
challenger
card.
+3 and everything.
Yep.
Yeah, with all the rush characters at the moment, I think in a big part because of the locations, this is pretty heartbreaking for Kida. I mean, she could still see some play. She's definitely an interesting tool for aggro decks, but in the current meta with lots of rush characters, the fact that you're not negating their strength, I think, is pretty heartbreaking for this card.
Mm-hmm. Next one is from Lateralis. They say, love the podcast, really helps. Could you guys post links to the deck? So I post the decks in the description. I just want to point this out because I'm sure other people have thought this. A lot of times when I try to post links to decks on Dreamboard, just like randomly, they don't work. I think it's like a caching issue or something like that, because sometimes when I open incognito, it works. But yeah, that's why I post them all written out. So hopefully that.
But if you sometimes just need to, like, if you open it, it doesn't work. If you just try opening it again and refreshing, you can get it to work. It's a bit buggy.
But the one thing I will say is, even if the way Brandon's doing it and just putting the lists in the description, there is like an import method on Dreamborn where if you have the lists in like text form, you'll be able to then import it as a deck on Dreamborn. So be sure to do that as well.
Mm-hmm. Next one is from Fantasy Factor. They say steel is the best color in the game. It keeps every other color in check. And then I had a follow-up question, which we already kind of talked about. I was going to ask, do we need better removal? And I also want to pose a card to you guys. I don't know what color it'd be in. 1 cost, uninkable, destroy. I'm not going to use the right terms, but destroy target creature. Its controller gains lore equal to its lore. Broken?
To its lore.
Could be attack, but I think to its lore.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say attack, and then you said lore.
You think it's busted?
It's completely broken.
It's
that amount of lore does not make up for.
What if it was attack? What if it was attack?
It would still be broken.
Still be broken, yeah.
I think it would destroy the shift mechanic. It would make the shift mechanic unplayable in like every aspect. Yeah. But I do hope we get some hyper efficient removal at some point, because I don't know. The mid range stuff is fun, but I like you were talking about this earlier, Speci. Like there are more non-linear decks that are playable. I hope that expands in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a huge thing for me. I mean, in Gwent, it's kind of what I was known for, is like seeing some kind of card which can be abused in a similar way to Jafar, and then just trying to actually like build something that works. So I've really enjoyed this set, like for that reason. Just like there's lots more to do. I think also like in reference to the metagame with set 1 and set 2 for Lorcana, I love deck building, but then playing the actual game, it was like leaving a bit for me to be desired. I think like set 2, especially at the start, it was a bit of like a rock, paper, scissors meta where you've kind of got like aggro, steal in the middle, and then control. Whereas now it just feels like everything is a lot more fluid. And I'm really enjoying the game a lot.
I felt like set 1 and set 2 were a game of rock, paper, scissors, gun, where there was rock, paper, scissors, but then there was Ruby Amethyst, which was just like the best.
I refuse to play Ruby Amethyst too. It's just not my style. I like being a hipster.
Yeah.
The Ruby Amethyst was the only way of at least somewhat escaping the rock, paper scissors style.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Well, again, if you want to get your question read out in next week's pod, just a comment on YouTube. We talked about pretty much all the topics. The last thing I wanted to mention here was that, I mean, the list that we're working on right now, and I'm super high on this list, and I previously set 1, set 2 hated this archetype in color combination, which is amber, steel, mid-range. I feel like this deck has gotten a lot of tools in terms of being a mid-range deck. Like previously in set 1 and set 2, I felt like if you were playing amber, steel and you weren't doing the unfair shift saying a whole new world, you were just losing a lot of games, especially versus control. I felt like you had almost no chance. It does feel like Amber Steel now can do the whole new world unfair thing, shift something, do it on turn 3, dump the whole entire hand. But they have so much more reach nowadays. They have this hyper efficient 2 cost in the form of Mr. Smeed. They have Beast. They have Robin Hood. The Big Cinderella is a great addition. And then it just has, like, I love the, this card is a card I'm actually pretty low on. because sometimes I think that the trade with bare necessities is not great, but it is so good in this list to yoink Be Prepared out of your opponent's hand at key times, or yoink a whole new world out of your opponent's hand when you know you can outvalue them with something like a beast in terms of card draw. I just didn't expect, off the back of that tournament, I looked at the winning list. I was a bit confused, to be honest. A lot of one ofs, a lot of two ofs, but ultimately the archetype and the ink combination, I think it's going to rise. I really do.
Yeah, I also think the core of the deck was built pretty well. Like, I liked the Shift Cinderella, the Rapunzel was kind of cute too, and I think seems like it's a pretty good way to go. The Robin Hood stuff is definitely good, but I definitely didn't like the stitches for sure, especially the Rockstar stitch.
What set the deck apart from most Ember Steelers, even if people weren't really playing much Ember Steel, but I think people were a little bit down on the lanterns, and I think lanterns are the correct way to go about Ember Steel at the moment. So I think
Benja in set 2 was pretty popular, but it's like nowhere to be seen at the moment. So
and it's not a good trade for your opponent if they have to rise off the Titans your lantern after your lantern already did something.
Yeah. Whereas Benja for a lantern is like game-winningly good, right?
And this is why Spessie's playing the lucky dime, because there's no benches in the meta.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a game-winning trade right there.
Okay, so one card we have to talk about for Amber Steel is Chernabog. One Chernabog is actually good in songs. I'm certain. So
I'm not certain.
I'm certain.
Okay, go ahead.
Let me explain why. So Chernabog, I think it's a card you only ever play one copy of. So Chernabog, if you guys are unfamiliar, it's an uninkable 10 cost, which has like 9 stats and quest for 3. If when you play this card, for every card that you have, every character card you have in your graveyard, it reduces its cost. So, and then it adds all of those characters in the graveyard back into your deck. So, obviously, if you find this card in your early hand, it's pretty disastrous. But with Lantern, you might be able to still get away with playing it at like 7 cost or something. And obviously, you're playing like Ariel, A Whole New World, so it shouldn't be too tricky to just get rid of it if that happens. But obviously, it's very good if you find it later on. You just dump it down for free. But I think what a lot of people are overlooking with this card is the fact that it's also helping you in a game where it's going to mill. This deck is struggling a lot when in games where it goes to mill, because you've got lots of card draw with obviously Let the Storm Rage on, Ariel, Beast, for example. But there's times where if the Chernabog is kind of in like the lower third of your deck, like the lower, like the last 20 cards or so, you're going to be able to play that Chernabog, and then suddenly just out of nowhere, you've got way more cards than your opponent in deck. And I think we saw actually a lot in the tournament this weekend. There was a lot of games that were, at least the threat of going to mill, were quite serious. And I think that it's a really interesting card for that reason. And I think I would always play one Chernabog in these decks.
For example, in game 3 of the other semifinal, Jeebus versus Ferrante.
Yeah, I think.
It was... no, Jeebus versus Brennan DiCanio. Right, that makes sense. They actually both were on like 7 to 8 cards, and Jeebus always stayed on one more card than their opponent so that they don't lose to the wheel. And in that specific scenario, having Chernabog and then reading would actually just completely close out the game. And I see the potential for the card drawing into it later, and also for not being made out in the longer drawn out games. It could be good enough. I'm just not sure about it, because the downside of drawing it early is extremely huge still.
Yeah, the downside of drawing it early is definitely big, but I think when you're playing A Whole New World deck and when you have lanterns, you can get away with it.
Also, just coming back to whether we need more efficient removal, I kind of want to have more removal, but at the same time, games are already so in that tournament, games were so drawn out. In the top cut, we didn't have any timer, so a few rounds took like 1 hour 20, 1 hour 30.
There was some ropers. Oh my goodness. I was pulling my hair out at the roping.
Yeah, there was some people that could have played faster, but even when they would play faster, I think there was some games that just naturally take very long. And I'm a little bit afraid games could be a little bit too slow if we get more efficient removal.
Yeah, big set 1 issue actually was Ruby Amethyst Mirrors, even with evasives, by the way. If you didn't have evasives, good luck finishing 3 games. But yeah, big issue in set 1 for sure. And It's a really unfun tournament experience, or actually just in-person experience. Doesn't have to be a tournament; it could be locals. But having a best of 3 where the possibility of getting to the third game is very unlikely it's just an unfun factor. I think it's always a factor, right? Like even if you're both playing aggro decks, someone could be playing egregiously slow, and I guess it's a threat. But when it comes to like, okay, we're both playing at a reasonable pace, and it's still extremely unlikely we get to play a game 3. I think it's definitely a fault of design. They should keep it in mind. I'm happy you mentioned Mill with this deck, because I didn't watch any of those matches. I've been playing some Amber Steel, and I milled 2 of my opponents. And I was actually pretty surprised about that. So yeah, it's a real threat.
It's
It
honestly
actually
like a
is,
really
yeah.
interesting like dynamic in the games when you're watching them as well as a viewer, where like as I was casting a lot of these games, I'm like, by the way, guys, like if this game goes on much longer, like there is like both players have to be considering it. Like as Moyen mentioned, like Jeebus or whoever it was kind of just staying 1 card ahead at all times. Like it does add like a really interesting extra layer to the games at points.
Yeah. If anybody played Ruby Amethyst prior to Evasives being added to the list in set 1, that was the true mill matchup, staying above a card on your opponent and then like broom shuffling, infinite comboing with brooms, and it was such a bad gameplay experience. But that is long gone. Anyway, that's all I had sort of on the docket today.
I have one
ahead.
question, guys, while I'm on the podcast. Something I spoke to Moyen about. What I've noticed since I've been posting videos in the last couple of weeks for Lorcana is my comment section are very angry at the amount of uninkable cards I include in my decks.
Oh yeah.
What do you guys think is the optimal amount of uninkable cards? Now, I also want to make a big point. Not all uninkable cards are created equally, so there's no way there's like just a set number, right? For example, Let the Storm Rage On is an uninkable card, but it's drawing you a card. So I feel like that should almost be valued at like half an uninkable or something in your deck, because there's a good chance it's going to draw you an inkable card when you play it, for example. But like, what are you guys looking at when you're playing? I go heavy on uninkables, like outrageously heavy on uninkables on average. And obviously the other thing to bear in mind is the heavier you are on uninkables, the less flexible you are with your mulligan, right? Like if you're on like 20 uninkables, you need to be very, very safe with your mulligan. Yeah. Whereas if you're playing less, you can be more aggressive with your mulligans.
Yep.
I think in set 1 and set 2, Brandon and me were probably playing the Ruby Amethyst versions with by far the most uninkables.
Nice.
But we also did the math, though. To be fair, we did the math.
Yeah, but I don't know. I think the math that we did have was also not taking into account some factors on like friends on the other side drawing 2 occasionally, or Merlin the Rabbit completely not, like that's not an uninkable. It draws me at least like 2 cards if I get to that, and it's very easy to get to that. So I think, personally, okay, how do I say this? I'm saying it anyway. I think it's kind of cringe to have this, you can only play X uninkables, and because some people have this vision where like, you play 16 uninkables, that's fine. You play 17, nah, that's terrible. Your deck's awful now. But what it is just, so every uninkable you add, not taking into consideration cantrips that replace themselves, but every uninkable you add has a cost of slightly. You have to slightly alter your mulligan, and you're running some slight extra risk. And just the more inkables you have, the higher the cost of adding an extra uninkable is. So that, let's say I already have a high amount of uninkables, then for me to add another uninkable, that uninkable has to be very good. Doesn't mean I will never do it just because I reached a certain number.
Yeah. The other reason it's cringe is because what are these people basing that on? I understand that you can have a feel for something, but if you're adamant that you're objectively correct about something like an uninkable ratio, and it's only based on anecdotal theory or an anecdotal evidence, it's like, yeah, obviously it's cringe. So the math on it, the math is not perfect, but it's pretty fucking close to perfect. like, okay, it doesn't account for, this is set 1 math, by the way. Doesn't account for friends on the other side, doesn't account for Maleficent drawing a card, but everything else it accounts for. It accounts for the mulligan, an extremely powerful mulligan in Lorcana. It's accounting for all of that. So there's additional factors you need to include, which is like your curve. How important is it that you hit 6 ink by turn 6? how important is it that you hit 7 ink by turn 7? It's drastically different, right? And let's say in old school Ruby Amethyst, set 1 Ruby Amethyst, and you can extrapolate this to set 3 or anything. But old school Ruby Amethyst, hitting 7 ink by turn 7, really important. You need be prepared. Ursula, like if you're missing your ink, so if you're missing your 7th ink, that's a big deal. So you want to have 7 ink by turn 7. Because of that, if you do the math and you account for that you can turbo mulligan for all inkables, you are 98% certain to have 7 ink by turn 7 if you have 18 uninkable cards. So you're like, okay, 98%.
Oh, that's a lot.
Yeah.
It's more than I thought it would be.
Yeah.
Yeah, but at the same time, that doesn't take into account that, okay, let's say how I need to get to 7 ink on 7, but also I want to play a card on 2, a card on 3 that doesn't replace itself. Like, then that gets a lot harder. Plus, it doesn't, I think that mulligan that was considering is probably like, oh, I'm keeping every inkable I see.
Turbo
right?
mulligan for inkables, yeah.
Yeah, and if you don't want to be have to be turbo mulliganing for inkables because you want to be mulliganing for key cards if you can. But so it's all like on a wide range, and it's just depending on how many unkables you need to mulligan differently, and also never think, okay, this amount of uninkables, okay, this amount isn't. It's just the cost changes from adding another uninkable.
Yeah,
It also like really depends on your deck, right? Like for example, Amber Steel Songs. If some of your uninkables are lanterns, which kind of pay for themselves, you've got Let the Storm Rage on, which replaces itself, but also you're able to sing a whole new world really early. Like I think that's an example of a deck which should be very, very heavy on uninkables, and yet we saw in this tournament winning deck it was only like 14. I would be pushing 20 minimum with a deck like that. But I also think that like the heavier you are on uninkables, the higher the ceiling of the deck is, but it also becomes more difficult to play.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so your ink curve matters as well. Like is it really important to get to 6 ink by turn 6, 7 ink by turn 7? But also I said 98%. And there's a reason why I said 98%, because that's the value you're looking for. This is, you can disagree with this theory, but there's a theory in card games that if there's anything that is at a game losing, like it's a game losing sort of detriment, right? Not having 7 ink by turn 7, missing your 7th land drop. You want to be above 98% to hit it. That's the idea. And then I think that if something is detrimental but not game losing, it's like above 95%. This is like an old Magic theory that they're extrapolating to Lorcana. I think it holds, but it's just like some sort of probability theory. We went with 21 uninkables in set 1, even though the math said you're 98. You need to be above 98% certainty to have 7 ink by turn 7, it is 18 uninkable cards. If you go to 21, it's 95.9%. But the reason we pushed it is because the deck, there is nuance, right? Use the math to get the baseline, but then you add in the nuance, and that's you just as a player. And the nuance is things like what used to be the book, right? That could draw cards. It's also Maleficent. It's also Singing Friends on the other side. That additional nuance allows you to maybe stretch the uninkables to something like 21 when the math doesn't necessarily support it, because the math isn't taking that into account. I don't think that the math is the end all be all, but it's a resource for sure.
Yeah. So the math's important, but it's then like, okay, if the math tells you by adding 2 extra uninkables, like I don't know, I add an extra 4% of the time that I don't hit 7 ink by 7, then you have to take that math and then decide, okay, will I win enough games that I otherwise would be losing by adding these uninkables, right? It's always a trade-off.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So I mean, TLDR is like, yeah, we are much higher on inkables, I think, than what it sounds like your comment section is. But
yeah, for sure.
Mostly because it is supported by math to be higher on these uninkables. Like that conclusion is supported by math. Whether you're on 21 or 22, or you're accounting for drawing cards with Tome, you're counting Maleficent or Merlin, that is not supported by math. And that's theory, right? But ultimately, the higher number of inkables is something that you can math out via hypergeometric calculations. I'll put a link to the article that was written by Frank Carson that we referenced in order to come to these numbers. But yeah, we're on the higher end for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. I do think in general, from what I've seen, the community are too afraid of putting lots of uninkables in their deck. But it's also, like I say, it does definitely make it more difficult. And people can whiff and have like a handful of uninkables once, and then they're like, "Oh, I've got to cut something." But like, it is going to happen occasionally, right? Like you said, like 1 in 50 games or so is like what you should kind of be looking at. And that's kind of could be an acceptable range. I think I'm quite possibly too high on the amount of uninkables to play. But in general, I think people are way too cautious. Even in a lot of the top meta like lists I'm seeing in tournaments, I think people can like this Steel Song deck is a huge example. Like there was only 2 copies of Zeus, and I'm just like I would always play 4 copies of that card in Amber Steel Songs, and you just have to find a way to make it work, in my opinion.
One thing I would
I also-
question though is like I'm not sure if that player made that decision to not include the Zeus because it was an inkable. They could also think that inkable cards that they're replacing it with are just more powerful. Like maybe they just want more characters on board.
I interviewed them, and they said that they didn't want to go any more copies of uninkables.
Oh, that's
They'd
wild.
like to be low on uninkables for consistency.
Also, I want to add to the discussion because right now we've only talked about the likeliness of whiffing on ink, about how important it is to play inkables. But that's not the only point, because the flexibility of which card you want to be inking and which card you want to be playing adds
true.
to the value of inkables. If I have like 3 cards in hand, I need to ink one of them, play the other 2. If they're all inkable, I can better choose to have the perfect card for the scenario that I'm expecting. So that's also something that, like, all of these things come together, and all of them are nuanced, and people should not be forgetting that this is far more complicated than even the math that we are using. But that doesn't mean that the math we're using is like worthless. It's still a good baseline to go off of.
And I think, honestly, this inkable uninkable system is like what makes Lorcana so great for me. Like, it makes the deck building so interesting. It makes the balance. Like you can have cards like Let It Go and Hades being, like we mentioned, like Hades is just so much better, but you still might run Let It Go because it's inkable. And I think like it makes the game fascinating. And even just the decision making actually in terms of like Moyen mentioned, like which cards you're inking, it is becoming, I think, the higher you go on inkables, the better the ceiling of your deck is, but then it's also making your decisions potentially like more difficult and more interesting as well. Like it's really fascinating. Like there's a lot of games I've been playing recently where I'm like, I inked the wrong card. And I think that's like a really fascinating dynamic of the game.
It's a subtle form of complexity that adds many more chances for you to make both you and your opponent to make mistakes, which is where skill expression comes from. And it's not like this. The thing is like I believe that Magic has this sort of position to make mistakes embedded into the phase system a lot and priority. And Lorcana doesn't have that. But Sam Black, I believe it's Sam Black, a famous Magic player, wrote an article about the detriment of these systems of putting cards down to ink, and that it's not good and it doesn't scale well because you're presenting players with so many decisions that they can make incorrectly, and it makes bad players really bad. But I think that it's seamless enough in Lorcana that it's not at the bad end of it yet, but it does give you a lot of agency over skill expression because it's actually extremely complex on what card to ink and what not to. Maybe it's not when you have a hand of 4 uninkables and 1 inkable and you need to ink in order to play your card, but ultimately over the course of a game, you have to be thinking about a lot of factors. Even like you think about the board state, what your opponent has, what's in your hand, what could come off the top of your deck, etc. Like it is an extremely complicated system, but it's presented as very simple because ultimately the actual description of what you have to do is very simple. Pick a card that has this little circle or design around it and put it down. But those decisions are extremely impactful in a game of Lorcana.
Yeah,
there's also like another decision which I find really interesting, which probably is like something a lot of less skilled players won't do. It's like you've got like a 1 or 2 cost card in hand, and obviously like usually you're just tempted to play that on curve, but in certain hand states it might be better to just hold on to that card and save it for ink for a later point.
100%.
It almost cost me game 2 of the finals, where I kept the Robin Hood on the play and it was met with a Cinderella. And I think it's a fine answer to have when the opponent doesn't drop Cinderella on 1, but playing it on 1 actually ended up hurting me a lot that I didn't have that ink later. I did top deck 3 uninkables in a row, but that's besides the point. I opened myself up to that happening just because I took that risk, which I shouldn't necessarily have taken. I think it's just basically it makes resource management interesting, as it's not just okay, when do I play which card, but also every turn you have this micro decision of what cards will be the most valuable over the next few turns of this game, or over the entirety of this game. And I think those decisions are incredible.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I just have an anecdote from like a set 1 game that I was playing in person. My opponent had my deck list because some people had net decked my deck at that point. So he had 21 uninkables. And I remember we played a game and he played out Archimedes turn 1 and then something turn 2, turn 3. And then on turn 4, he goes pass and doesn't ink something. And I was like, what? And the next turn doesn't ink something. He was like, yeah, man. And ultimately loses the game because, yeah, I just drew these uninkables. I was like, bro, what is this? You can't play a 2/2 Archimedes if you have 3 inkables in hand. It's like, it's not even an option. It's not even a possible play line. You just have to accept it. If I, being the second turn player, have Archimedes plus uninkables, I'll be 3 lore ahead or something before you get Maleficent down. But like, there's a, like, it is with that deck in that context, it was actually not even a reasonable play line to take because there's no reason to take the risk of the top of the deck feeding you inkables or not. Like, you just can't play the 1-drop Archimedes. I think it happens less in set 3 because we're so tempo based and playing on 1-drops is very, very powerful right now. But yeah, it is, I guess it is a bit of like a level up or something that you realize as you play more where it's like, maybe I don't play this on curve. This is a resource. I need this.
Yeah, you're kind of just conditioned to slam a card on curve, right? But often it can be better to not.
I think it's also the biggest decision for Ember Steel decks. And coming back to Robin Hood, because Robin Hood is a card that's insanely good if you can shift onto him on 3. But every time you don't have the big Robin Hood, you have to be seriously asking yourself, how likely am I to draw into it until I need it? And how bad is me playing this Robin Hood if I cannot shift onto it? Because it can easily lose you the game. But also, at the same time, if you draw into the shift Robin Hood on turn 2 or 3 and you didn't put that Robin Hood down, that can also be detrimental. So there's
Do you know how you
a lot
can
of
solve that
interesting
problem?
decisions in that.
You cut it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, then you just never shift Robin Hood and never do powerful stuff.
All right. Spessy, I want to give you a chance to shout out where people can find you, what you're up to, etc.
Yeah, I'm posting loads of stuff on YouTube at the moment, so I didn't get like a custom URL on this channel yet, but like if you search Specimen Lorcana, you'll find me. I'm also streaming on Twitch, which is twitch.tv/Specimen.
Specimen.
Yeah.
All right. Sweet. Again, appreciate you coming on the podcast. Always have great conversations when you join us. If you're listening to this and you enjoy it, if you're new to the podcast, potentially you found us last week, number one thing you can do is leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Also on YouTube, you can hit that subscribe button. It helps us keep those lights on, like I mentioned. There's a video version of this on YouTube at youtube.com/@Podcana podcast. Again, check the description for anything we talked about. And Twitter's our BrennanAPG, Kawatech_CG, Moyen_HS, and it's Specimen. Thank you all so much for listening. We'll see you next week.